Good morning and welcome to the second of Freeth's Energy, Waste and Sustainability Sector Group webinars for 2021, and this one is on bioenergy. If you want to access our previous webinars, and we've been running them now for a couple of years, then links to them can be found on the Energy, Waste and Sustainability page of the Freeth's website. The previous 2021 webinar was an introduction to sustainability, and the recording and slide deck for that are on the website. And last year we ran a series of webinars on EV infrastructure. Today we have a mix of Freeth's and industry speakers to discuss the current market and future opportunities afforded by bioenergy. We also have some poll questions, and there should be time at the end for your questions, so send them through. If we don't have time at the end to put your questions to the panel, then we'll collate the answers to all questions raised and circulate those early next week together with the recording and slide deck. So our first speaker this morning is Freeth's own Liam O'Flynn. Over to you, Liam.
Thanks, Kirsten, and good morning, everyone. Along with other green tech, clean tech and renewables, bioenergy has been the subject of increased scrutiny in recent years, which is one of the reasons we want to focus on it for the purposes of this morning's sessions. But before we get into the main parts of today's session, we thought it'd be useful to frame what it is we're talking about. So what is bioenergy? So if we move to the next slide. In the government's energy white paper released at the end of 2020, bioenergy was defined as heat or electricity produced using biomass or gaseous and liquid fuels with a biological origin, such as biomethane produced from biomass. In essence, there's only two parts to this definition. The first part is the energy, i.e. the production of heat or electricity. The second is the bio, i.e. what method or feedstock do we use to create that heat or electricity. At its very core then, bioenergy is the production of heat or electricity where the feedstock is organic matter or comes from something that is or was alive. So if we move to the next slide, typically this feedstock comes in two different forms. Dry feedstock is what one might also refer to as feedstock for a traditional biomass plant. It's dry combustible organic material which is burnt to generate heat or electricity. Examples of this would include the use of sustainable wood pellets, as is the case at the Drax power station, or plant matter. Wet feedstock, on the other hand, is what would typically be fed into an anaerobic digestion plant, which may consist of food waste or sewage. Here, rather than directly burning the feedstock, it's put into sealed tanks and left to ferment. In the absence of oxygen, the microorganisms in the feedstock create biogas, which can be used in CHP plants, burnt to produce heat and in turn electricity, or scrubbed of contaminants and used as a direct replacement for natural gas. Now, whilst the distinction can be drawn between different bioenergy plants based on their feedstock, other distinctions can be drawn based on the technologies employed at the plant. Now, we've already mentioned the combustion or incineration technologies in relation to dry feedstock. This is where the biomass is burnt to heat water, which in turn creates steam, drives turbines, creates electricity. And as we mentioned, this technology is most commonly associated with a typical biomass facility. Similarly, we've also mentioned the other main technology, anaerobic digestion, in reference to wet feedstock, where the biomass creates gas. But there are other advanced conversion technologies which apply to dry feedstock. For instance, there's pyrolysis. This is where the feedstock firmly decomposes in the absence of oxygen. Now, for an example of this, it's one of the processes involved in charring wood and creating charcoal. The products of pyrolysis may be stored for later use, or the gas byproducts may be burnt in a gas engine to generate heat and or electricity. And as you'd expect, this technology is associated with biomass pyrolysis plants. There's also gasification. This is where the feedstock is heated with more oxygen than in pyrolysis, but not enough to lead to combustion. And in gasification, the solid fuels can also create a product biogas. Traditional models of biomass have focused on combustion technologies and have been exhibited as far back as early man burning trees, plants, and animal waste. In comparison, though, gasification has additional functionality to combustion, as the biogas can be used not only to create heat and power, but also in other industrial processes, like creating hydrogen, bioliquids, other biofuels, or using the creation of other chemicals and plastics. As we mentioned earlier, the focus of this session is primarily on biomass and anaerobic digestion plants, but we think it's important at the outset to note that bioenergy is a broad topic, and could extend to include a number of other aspects of the wider energy industry, such as using biogas as the primary fuel for gas turbine CHP plants, using organic matter as feedstock for energy from waste plants, and the creation of liquid fuels from organic matter, such as bioethanol and biodiesel for use in transport. Whilst these are all important aspects of bioenergy, they sadly are not the focus of today's session, although may form the focus of a future one. Hopefully, that overview helps set the scene for the rest of this morning's discussion. We've now got a quick poll question about which technology you think will win out in the long term, and then we'll hand over to Ricky, who will look at the current bioenergy market and future opportunities.
Great, thanks Liam, and hopefully that poll question has come up. I wanted to give you a bit of an overview around the current market dynamics and what impact COVID has had around that. And so I will start by looking at the feedstock and sort of leading through to the financial performance of the plants around the country, or a selection thereof, and to give a bit of a view as to where I think the future direction is going to go in biomass. So if we look at the wood market, so as Liam's talked to the solid fuel, wood has been a challenging market dynamic for the energy generation plants. The primary driver of that has been that there's been a lot of consolidation in the wood supply market. And that has meant that there's been quite a lot of supplier power, meaning that there is a lack of choice for energy generators as to where they source their wood from. So initially, when plants were developed, they were looking at, in a sort of pre-COVID world, of looking at trying to charge a gate fee of around £40 a tonne. What has actually happened is that those plants are paying for wood, which has significantly impacted the financial performance. The other main feedstock that we're covering today is food waste. Now, this is a very local market, and the gate fees range from, in Scotland, to being sort of £40 a tonne, to in London, where it has been as low as £0 in the last few years. So again, very difficult to establish a commercial model that works on a large scale across the country. So it's the biomass market for feedstock is patchy and variable. COVID has had a very severe impact on the wood market as construction stopped, leading to a significant reduction in recycled wood in the marketplace. This was up to 90% in the peak of lockdown. So there was huge competition for that feedstock to keep plants running, and therefore the economics was significantly affected. So this sort of sounds like a bit of a downer on the technology, and I think there's just a commercial question as to how this is going to balance out, and the markets will themselves eventually. But when that happens is a question for the future. We'll have a little look at that in a bit. The next thing I wanted to pick up was technology issues. So we have the three main technologies that Liam has mentioned, which is the gasification, combustion, pyrolysis, and I probably lump gasification and pyrolysis together as advanced thermal treatment, and the anaerobic digestion. Combustion, incineration, and anaerobic digestion are well-established technologies that are reliable and used by waste companies across the chain, and that they are proven and very much bankable. Gasification has done well in the past in terms of getting funding, and pyrolysis has been challenging, I think it would be fair to say, in the past. So although I will say that I am seeing more people looking in that area, particularly around plastics, rather than necessarily biomass. So gasification has had some fairly significant technology issues, and we'll come on to it a bit in in the review of the financial performance, but there have been a combination of design errors, and actually gasification has a relatively small operating window. So when there are any issues with feedstock, or there are problems with transporting material through the plant, if you get a lot of snagging issues, it can lead to lower uptimes than people were expecting. And that has been the case with a number of plants that I've been involved with and have looked at from the outside. So that has led to the mixed financial performance. And I've sort of included some examples here. So if we sort of work through them, if we look at Tilbury Green Power, that is a Macquarie Green Investment Group project. It's been an expensive build. It's a large plant, but when looking at their accounts, they have already incurred 26 million of impairment losses, which is not great. I'll then look at the next three slightly together. So Ince Biopower, Mersey Bioenergy and Birmingham Biopower, they are all projects that have been funded by Bioenergy Infrastructure Group. They have a variety of success, but I look at Mersey Bioenergy and I'm sort of looking at that and going, we've got an EBITDA of 6.5 million, which gives us a 15-year simple payback, which I don't think allows for some great project returns, or certainly probably it is not in line with the original forecasts. So I think there are some real challenges for the sector, and it's a challenge also for the EPC contractors. For example, if we look at Welland Biomass as the bottom example, there was a 5.4 million liquidated damages claim that is excluded from that EBITDA result that I'm showing, and that is in part, I think, the reason why we have EPCs that are leaving the sector. So BWSC is an example that is currently retrenching, and it feels like we need to potentially have a bit of a rethink about how we do this and what the commercial model looks like. So if we could have a look at now on the future of the market, and there are a number of options. So I have looked at projects where there is a potential change to municipal solid waste. This has a biogenic content, which means that you can still achieve some of the rocks if the plant is allocated to rocks, but it's a lower percentage. But in that case, you are getting a gate fee, which changes your commercial dynamics quite dramatically. Again, the same can be said for sludge and biosolids, which is probably a more nascent market, which has primarily been focused on anaerobic digestion, but is potentially a pyrolysis, gasification, incineration product if you dry it and prepare it to a fairly significant degree. So there is work to do to prepare that fuel. So there's a cost benefit analysis to that. Some of the gasification plants we've looked at using different technologies. So I am aware of some that have looked to move to a moving great incineration technology, just because you then guarantee the availability and uptime. There is a cost to doing that, and the question effectively you end up doing a new project, which is not ideal, but maybe better than having a very low returning project for a long period. And as I've mentioned, there are some more pyrolysis technology moves in the space, and looking at different feedstocks and how that can work. The general idea is to try and increase the gate fee, increase your secured revenue, and retain a proportion of the subsidy so that you end up in a much better commercial position and can afford the additional engineering works to repurpose the plant. The other things that I think will link in nicely to some of the subsidy conversations later on is that we can consider different outputs. So in some cases, gas to grid may be a more effective solution if you're looking at a low CFD value or something like that. Alternatively, where you've got gas offtake, depending on your subsidy regime, where you're located, whether you can do any direct wire, can form a sleeved PPA arrangement. There are various different ways of maximising your outputs and value from the electricity that you're generating. And heat offtake is a growing part of these projects, and including that can be transformational for project returns, particularly if you've got, for example, a large industrial area nearby where you can channel excess heat. So where these plants have been challenged, there are very definitely options as to how to improve returns, and potentially there, with a bit of extra capital, you can actually turn what is a struggling project into something that makes a commercial return on the enlarged amount of capital. So it needs the right people and the right engineering minds to do this, alongside some funders that are willing to accept the risk and gain the rewards of the additional work that needs to be put into some of these facilities. So I believe I'm now passing over to Claire.
That's right. Thanks, Ricky. Hi, everyone. I'm Claire King. I'm a partner in Freeths, specialising in clean energy, and I'm going to be transitioning away from biomass and moving on to talk about anaerobic digestion, specifically the Green Gas Support Scheme, which is due to launch later this year. Next slide, please, Tom. So the GGSS, which doesn't exactly trip off the tongue, is intended to replace the non-domestic renewable heat incentive, which closed to new applications in March of this year. The GGSS will be funded by a green gas levy collected from gas suppliers, unless, of course, they already source almost exclusively green gas. Both the support scheme and the levy are expected to launch this autumn. Next slide, please, Tom. So the GGSS isn't a wholesale replacement for the RHI, as it supports only the production of biomethane from anaerobic digestion, although the door has been left open for it to support other green gases such as hydrogen in the future. The intention is that it will be open for applications for 4 years from autumn 2021 and will offer support for 15 years. The tariffs are tiered according to the level of production, and the proposed rates are set out there on the slide. There will be annual tariff reviews to reflect any changes to things like plant construction costs. And in addition to that, there is the possibility of quarterly tariff digressions. That mechanism will kick in if forecast expenditure thresholds are breached. In terms of the support scheme application process, it will mirror the current tariff guarantee process for the RHI, i.e. applicants will apply in advance of construction and secure a certain tariff subject to building out according to plan. Next slide, please, Tom. So to be eligible for the Green Gas Support Scheme, 50% of the biomethane by energy content must be produced using waste or residue feedstocks, which is as per the RHI. Note that a mid-scheme review of that waste feedstock threshold is planned, presumably around autumn 2023. Feedstock reporting will be as per the RHI, i.e. the fuel measurement and sampling procedure that you'll be familiar with. Just a few final notes. The GGSS will be only available to support construction of new AD plants, not the expansion or upgrade of older plants. Also, Ofgem will allow the transfer of GGSS accreditations or registrations between parties which will enable biogas production plants to be bought and sold with the ability to receive GGSS payments. And finally, another note, biomethane producers can operate both under the GGSS and the Renewable Transport Fuel Obligation, but as you might expect, an individual consignment of biomethane cannot be supported twice, i.e. you have to choose one scheme or the other, although you can switch between the two. You read my mind, Tom, thanks. Next slide. There are some links there where you can find further information, but I will now hand over to Sam Smith from Anagira, who will be covering the current UK AD and biogas industries. Thanks, Sam.
Thanks, Claire. Morning, everyone. Just really quickly to explain who Anagira are. So we're a global company and we focus in organics recovery and essentially getting bioenergy out of organics. So I'm, I guess, representing the AD and biogas industry at this point here. So I think that's enough on Anagira. Next slide, please, Tom. So yeah, as Claire was just saying, the AD and biogas industry in the UK maybe has had a bit of a tough time in the last maybe 2 or 3 years, perhaps a little longer. So for any of you who were following it or involved in it, we had what might be described as a boom back in, I'd say, what, 2012, 2013 through to 2016, 2017 with, you know, really lucrative feed-in tariff subsidies on electric, and then the RHI scheme that we just talked about, the non-domestic heat incentive. But that there's been a lot of uncertainty about what the replacement to that scheme, you know, will it be continued, will it not? And I think anyone who's been in the industry over the last few years is, I think will agree with me that it's created a lot of uncertainty and it's slowed down the market quite a bit. So there's not been a lot of new builds. There have been some. They've managed to burn through some of this uncertainty, but there's definitely been a slowdown. So this new green gas support scheme is definitely galvanizing the market. That's what we can see. We do expect there to be a lot of new build AD projects coming back on the table now. There's a lot, I think we've seen there's a lot of projects that were developed a few years ago, perhaps, and then were put on ice because of this uncertainty. They are now coming back. You know, projects that may have planning and decided not to go ahead because of the revenue uncertainty. Now with this green gas support scheme, that we are definitely seeing that, and I think with the addition, which I didn't put on the slide here, but with the addition of legislation pushing to more organic segregation from household waste, etc., that really is going to, we feel, push the combination of all these factors is really going to start pushing the AD industry in the UK. Again, you're going to see more new build opportunities coming up very shortly. We can see them coming at us right now. So that's our sort of crystal ball forecast for you know, things are looking really good. I think for the next few years in the UK AD industry. To try and cover, I said this to everyone at Freeze, to try and cover anything substantial in 10 minutes is hard. So what I thought I'd do is, you know, with these opportunities coming back on the market, there's one of the things we're really bad at as an industry is, as any industry, particularly a technical one, is bad at this, is we have jargon. And there's a lot of throwaway comments that if they're taken the wrong way, they go, they can completely confuse an opportunity for. So I've thrown some examples there on the slide. You know, people will throw these things at you if you get into the AD sales opportunities. Oh, it's a 1 megawatt plant. Oh, it's a 30,000 ton a year plant. Oh, it's a 40 gigawatt biomethane plant. You know, these things are thrown around, and I just take 5 minutes now, maybe helpful to some of you. Apologies if it's teaching others of you to suck eggs, but maybe just drop to the next slide, Tom, and we'll. So just sort of showing some of this around. Claire was just talking about the green gas support scheme, and that tier 1, I think you saw on the slide, was 60,000 megawatt hours per annum. That's the top of tier 1. So that would be perhaps a target for when you're putting a new AD plant together. So that's maximizing the revenue you get from that best value subsidy on the green gas support scheme. So what does that really mean? So somebody will say a 60 gigawatt hour plant, but One of my colleagues who's got more experience in the AD industry than me actually admitted to me yesterday, when somebody said 60 gigawatt hours, I had to get my calculator out and work out what that means in biogas per hour, because that's the only way he can think. That's how he sees a plant. So I think there's a certain amount, everybody, even in the industry, has an issue with their own jargon sometimes. So 60 gigawatt hours is that's the energy that you inject into the gas grid. So assuming you're injecting into the grid here under the GGSS, that's what actually goes into the grid as calculated energy. Taking that back a notch, you can see 5.9 million cubic meters an hour, and then to the right there, the jargon buster there. So you'll hear people talk about cubic meters per hour when they're talking about a biomethane plant. So a 60 gigawatt plant actually translates to around 675 standard cubic meters of biomethane being injected into the grid every hour. So that's an important figure to be sure of, because that's what you need in terms of your gas grid export capacity. So if you're looking at opportunity and the gas grid report says you've got 500 cubic meters an hour going into the grid, and they're telling you it's a 60 gigawatt hour plant, it's not, because you won't get the gas in the grid. It's not something you can save up and catch up. And ideally, you would want more than 675. You probably want a bit of extra headroom in your ability to inject. So that's a really key consideration when you're looking at AD plants for biomethane. It is the grid connection. And that's the scale of it, which I think if you're comparing with RHI tier 1, which was where a lot of people set there, that was at 40 gigawatt hours. So these I suspect the GGSS plants are going to be bigger. They're going to need bigger gas connections. So there's going to be a little bit more, and the gas grids, that's what it's for, to get renewable gas into the UK gas network. So hopefully all of the network operators are on board. But that's, I think, going to be a bit of a pressure point, because they are bigger connections, which have a little bit more complication, and grid sensitivity comes in, etc. But pulling back, you can see there's a little tweak, which I always love, which is the difference between standard and normal cubic meters. You see the 5.9 to the 6.2 million. It's something that it always makes me laugh. You have standard conditions that the grid network operators work to, and normal conditions that everybody, normal and standard, are not normal or standard. And you need to be really careful on this, because you can see it's actually quite a substantial difference if you apply the different conditions technically. And I've seen financial models where people have been putting together viability studies on projects, and they go, oh, it doesn't work. And then somebody points out that actually their units are slightly wrong. And suddenly that little uplift in percentage, you're starting to make revenue. So these are all sort of cautions when we're looking at opportunities, that we need to get the units right, and don't just take somebody's statement of X cubic meters an hour as just ask. Really, it's asking the question, what does that really mean? What units are you using, and where are you saying that is? Because you work back up, and at the bottom there, you've got 11.5 million cubic meters of biogas per year. That's what 60 gigawatt hours is when you make those assumptions there, which is 1,300 cubic meters of biogas an hour, which is, as I say, my colleague in the industry, we talk in biogas per hour, because that's how we think, because we think technically. So just an idea there, really. Just next slide, sorry, Tom. Another standard thing that we do in the industry is we talk in terms of, we often refer to a megawatt size of a plant. And actually that's very incorrect in a lot of cases, unless you know what you're talking about, because most of the time people are referring to the electrical output equivalent. So if you had a CHP on, it would be a 1 megawatt or a 2 megawatt or a 3 megawatt CHP. But that doesn't relate at all to the 60,000 megawatt hours that we talked about previously. So again, if you're comparing like for like, just be careful there, because a 60 gigawatt plant, as I've shown there, if you work it through, because of the lower efficiencies of conversion on a CHP, in terms of what you're going to get in terms of your electrical, you're only at only 41% of the potential energy, something around that region, that the CHP goes into electrical generation. So actually a 60 gigawatt hour biomethane plant is the equivalent of a 3 megawatt electric plant. It was interesting. We had a customer who had a permit in place for his CHPs that he thought was for I can't remember what it was, I think it was a 2 megawatt or something like that, but actually he had 2 megawatts thermal on his permit, which meant that actually he was only able to operate a 1 megawatt electric CHP, and he'd been doing it for years. So nobody had picked up on this. We managed to fix it, but you can see how even between regulators, you can get into some quite hot water if you don't get your units right. Next slide, sorry, Tom. And then the other thing is, this is really quite important, is we always say this, it's an Anagira thing we say all the time, it's all about feedstock. The shape of an AD plant is massively different depending on what you put in it. So I don't like, but there's a lot of people who do it, bless them, and they talk about, you know, the tons per year into a plant. That is fine as long as you know what you're comparing with. You need to make sure you're maybe literally comparing apples with apples, because 30,000 tons of one material is definitely not 30,000 tons of another material. So again, you can see at the bottom there, taking that same 60 gigawatt hour GGSS tier 1 plant, that's roughly what feedstock quantities would be. So you're talking 56,000 tons of a segregated food waste, say a household collected type food waste. But a compliant mix, as Claire was saying, you need to have a minimum of 50% waste. So put cattle manure there in an agricultural, so maize and cattle manure, a 50-50 mix. You need 134,000 tons. So double what it would be, if you know what I mean. And then there's another, the OFMSW, another nice bit of jargon there, but that's basically the organics containing fraction of your black bag waste, your residual waste. You'd need over 100,000 tons of that to give you the equivalent gas production of 56,000 tons of segregated food waste, based on how the UK is done. So I guess in terms of the jargon, it's really about making sure that I guess my advice would be just always double check what people mean when they say something. Don't assume. There's a lot of us in the industry who are been in here 15 years or more, who are still finding these errors coming through, and hopefully we see a lot of investment, and there's definitely a lot of opportunity in the AD and biogas industry right now in the UK, and hopefully we're really keen we don't repeat some of the mistakes that have come from a lot of these misunderstandings, shall we say, that can go very, very deep into a project if you let them. And I think that's the last slide then, Tom. But
so
thanks, guys. I'll pass over to Kirsten. Sorry.
Yes, thank you, Sam. So I'm going to pick up on a few of the things that Ricky and Sam have said around feedstock. So Tom, if you want to put up my first slide. So feedstock is what you put into one of these facilities in order to see what you get out of it. The first slide is a repeat of Liam's slides, just to show that we're talking about bioenergy here, so anything that goes in has to be of an organic nature. If you go to my next slide, please, Tom. So different feedstock types, and as I say, as Liam's already said, for the production of bioenergy, we're talking about feedstock of biological origin. And to pick up on something that Sam's just said, it's always the case that you can only get out what you put in, and it's amazing how often you have to repeat that. It's not magic, and for the older members of our audience, it's not the chocolate biscuit factory run by the mice in Bagpuss. You've got to have the right ingredients going in to get out what you're hoping to get out. Next slide, please. So here are some figures. So biomass plants are going to have waste wood going into them, and these figures are just to give you an indication of the waste wood generated in the UK each year, what's recycled, what's turned into biomass, etc. But even with those huge numbers, I'm currently acting for people who are having to import waste wood from Europe, which obviously will have additional costs attached to it, as well as it all being a bit more tricky after Brexit. Next slide, please. And then similarly, here are some figures for what food waste there is. This is from WRAP. WRAP and the UK government are trying to reduce the amount of food waste there is and that's from farm, as they call it, because a lot of it is wasted on the farm, through households or businesses, right to the point where hopefully it's not going into landfill, although lots still does these days, but instead will be going into some kind of bioenergy plant. Next slide, please. The thing I really wanted to pick up in this bit of the talk, though, is what a changing landscape we're currently in. As Ricky mentioned, COVID led to a lack of wood, and several biomass plants were unable to run, were shut down. Some I know are in fact converting to using RDF as an energy source instead of waste wood because of the lack of wood. Why was there a lack of wood? Well, the HWRC sites all shut down, so all that domestic wood wasn't being produced. Construction shut down initially, so there was no wood for a long time. Those who had it were able to sit on it and charge massive prices for it, which was a problem for the facilities. On top of that, we've currently have several live waste industry consultations going on, all of which, or together of which, will combine into the new Environment Act, which is currently a bill going through Parliament. But they are really going to change what waste is collected in this country, both from households and businesses, and where it's collected. So we have extended producer responsibility, which is passing the costs of collection of waste from local authorities back to the producers of it, with the aim of persuading those producers of waste to reduce what they create. For the purposes of this talk, there is also a current consultation on consistency in household and business recycling in England, a bit of a mouthful. But the key things coming out of that for the purposes of today are the government is very likely to say that there is going to be mandatory separate food waste collections, which means that there will be more food waste going into AD or composting facilities. As Sam mentioned, this means good opportunities for the AD industry in particular. The government's also likely to say that there should also be some separate collection of garden waste. At the moment, those local authorities which do collect garden waste charge for it, and they're not going to be able to charge for all of it, at least going forward. And the reason for mandatory separate collection of food waste in particularly is to clean up the recyclers. If you remove the food waste that contaminates the items that could be recycled, you've got more of a chance of being able to recycle them. But importantly, that will mean that there is far more food waste for AD plants. Next slide, please. So finally, and I'm a waste contracts lawyer at Freeths, what does this mean for contracts? So firstly, and this picks up on something that Sam said, all feedstock agreements are going to stipulate that the feedstock being provided must comply with the specification, and there'll be a detailed specification at the back of the agreement. Why is that? Well, as I said, it's not magic. You get out of an AD facility or a biomass facility what you put in. But perhaps even more importantly, if the wrong feedstock is put into one of these facilities, it can cause monumental problems. It can even cause the facility to have to shut down with the resulting sort of lack of income. And I've known of an AD plant where somebody delivered food waste, liquid food waste, which I think had bleach in it, and therefore the whole facility had to be shut down and cleaned out before any more feedstock could be added. It can be a very tricky process to turn food waste into gas and electricity. If you get it wrong, as I say, it can lead to a complete shutdown. So your contract will deal with, firstly, the fact that any feedstock's got to comply with the specification, and then what happens if there's a failure to comply. So the first stage in the process is to catch that failure to comply really early on with inspections and a right for the operator to reject the feedstock. But that's not as easy as it sounds. You can't always look at something and tell that it's not right, particularly with the level of detail that specifications go into. Nextly, there might be liquidated damages or indemnities which entitle the operator of the facility to recover on a pound for pound basis the losses it suffers as a result of that feedstock being delivered that wasn't to spec. It's not the greatest of remedies. It takes months and months and months, if not years, to bring that kind of claim and get your money back. And what's happening to your facility in the meantime? Is the feedstock provider good for it? Probably they're a lot smaller than the operator. So, ideally, as I say, things don't go wrong. It's great having contractual remedies, but it's the last thing you want to have to rely on. The other thing we encounter in feedstock agreements, and this is to do with who's investing in the building of the facility in the first place, is you need consistency of supply for a long, long time. 20 years, 25 years is not unusual. And that can be difficult for feedstock providers to comply with, particularly at the moment when I say there's such a changing landscape in this country as to what waste is going to be collected and where. Everybody's feeling very jittery and trying to put on somebody else the risk of waste changing in that geographical area. And there's going to be a bit of a bun fight in the contracts that are negotiated this year and over the next couple of years in relation to that. And in relation to that then, the operator needs to know, as I say, that it's going to get feedstock that complies with the specification for a long time. Otherwise, it can't sort of build its business model and work out what it's doing. So there are what's known as GMTs, guaranteed minimum tonnages, and obligations on the feedstock provider to provide a guaranteed minimum tonnage per day, per week, per year of feedstock to the spec. And if it fails to do so, we would include what's called put or pay clauses. So either deliver it or pay for us to get it elsewhere. Not always easy. As I said, in relation to wood, you know, people are currently importing wood. You would have thought we'd have enough waste wood of our own, but we don't. It depends where you are in the country. You don't always. And finally, the operator will put in rights of termination of the feedstock agreement if things aren't working out. But again, that still leaves it in the position of trying to find somebody else to supply that feedstock in order to keep its facility running. So the sort of message to take away in relation to my segment, I guess, is changing landscape. A lot of things up in the air, a lot of concerns, but again, to pick up on something Sam said, masses of opportunities, particularly for AD facilities. So that brings us to the end of our formal talks this morning. I don't know, oh, there's another poll question if you want to have a quick look at that. And then if anybody does want to raise any questions, please send those through. Or if you think of questions after the end, please do feel free to email them through, and we'll still put those to our panelists who can deal with questions later, and we can circulate those when we circulate the recording and the slide deck. So I'll give you a couple more minutes to, not minutes, sorry, seconds, to finish the poll question. We'll also circulate the answers to the poll, not the answers, but the responses to the poll questions when we're circulating everything. So we have a question that's just come through. If the government enforces food waste collections, do you think local authorities will be able to buy themselves out of existing contracts? Buy themselves out of existing contracts. Part of the legislation is that there will be transitional arrangements where the government will give local authorities some money to help them with contractual variations. I've not seen anywhere that the government's going to give enough money for a local authority to buy itself out of an existing contract. No. So I think it's going to be a case of trying to vary contracts where it can. And I don't think that's necessarily going to be easy. I don't know, Sam or Ricky, if you've got any views on that.
If I put my old Biffa hat on, then I would look at this as saying it's a change in service. So you would end up with a bit of a fight between the Waste Collection Authority and the Waste Disposal Authority. So that's one of the anomalies in the UK, is that some smaller authorities will collect and will be part of a larger disposal arrangement. So if I take the example of Oxfordshire, where I am, you have a number of waste collection authorities, including the Vale of Whitehorse, South Oxfordshire District Council, and there is one waste disposal authority for Oxfordshire, which agrees for the incineration contracts for waste. So you end up with conflicting objectives of two different local government authorities. A good example of a unitary authority is Cornwall, which used to have 6 collection authorities and now has all banded together, and Cornwall acts as one, which is why they have the Cornwall Energy Recovery Centre in St Denis. So I think there will be a bit of bit of a mix, and there will be some very frantic local authority discussions as to how they can vary these contracts. And it will provide actually an opportunity for contractors who don't have terribly profitable contracts to change the service. And there's probably not a lot of choice until the contract comes up for tender for the local authorities around who they use and what it costs them.
Thank you. We've also been asked a question, what might the timescale for the mandatory collection of food waste be? I've got in the back of my head about 2024. I mean, it's all been delayed because of COVID. The consultations were supposed to have taken place. I mean, these are the second rounds of most of these consultations. They were supposed to have taken place at least a year ago. The one about consistency of food collection is still live, closes early July if anybody wants to contribute to that one. Ricky, I don't know if you have a different answer to that, but as I say, I think it's about 2024.
Yes, very much. 2023 was the original target, and I assume that's slipping along with other things such as deposit return schemes and other various legislation. So I can't see it really happening 24 and maybe even 25 by the time everyone's had a good wrangle over it in Parliament and consultations.
And the other thing, of course, and picking up on what Ricky was just saying in response to the first question, there's not necessarily the facilities in the right places to address all of this additional food waste that's going to be collected. So yes, that's an opportunity, but it's not that you can pop up one of these AD plants overnight or even in sort of 3 to 6 months. It takes years of planning. So a lot of local authorities are worrying at the moment about what additional infrastructure they're going to need as a result of separate food waste collections. And there will be some government support for that, but it's very unclear and local authorities are currently very unhappy. We don't have any more questions at the moment. As I said, feel free to send through questions after, if you think of them afterwards, and we'll address them. But other than that, I want to say thank you very much to all of our speakers today, Sam Smith of Anagira and Ricky Thomas, and yeah, just to say thank you very much for attending, and we'll keep in touch with news of further webinars that we're going to be holding in the future. Thank you very much.